Dr. Smith, maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Hello, I'm Selwyn Manning and you are watching A View from Afar. And as always, we are joined by Paul Buchanan, political scientist and also former Pentagon analyst, to discuss a number of big political issues. For example, if the probabilities of a presidential incumbent Donald Trump do appear to be less likely as the weeks approach the US elections. The probabilities, particularly of the incumbent here, look increasingly unlikely, and it's still possible, but more improbable, that he wins the White House. If Democratic candidate Joe Biden wins the presidency, what we're looking at today is what would this mean for the rest of the world, and what would Joe Biden's foreign policy look like, and who, most significantly, would be the likely contenders to join a Joe Biden administration. But first, here's an invitation to those of you who are joining us live. If you are joining us via Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, feel free to make comments. And if you do, we'll be able to include your interactions in the program. So let's cross to Paul for a deep dive into these big political issues. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Selwyn.
There's obviously a lot happening on the side of the United States at the moment, particularly the trends as we look at who is firming up as the most likely winner of the US presidential elections. What are you making of the trends so far, Paul?
Well, this is a really good follow-up to last week's podcast, because we discussed the increasing irrationality of Donald Trump and the impact it has both domestically as well as in terms of U.S. foreign relations. And so this week we're turning to the possibility that if the trends continue, Trump is going to lose, something we speculated about last week, and which increasingly appears to be the case. The trends do not look favorable for him. And so then, again, putting on my former hat as a futures forecaster, what about a Biden win and its impact on U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, it's really
back. Can they go back to the Obama years? Do they need to do new things? Is the damage irreparable? Because what Trump has done to the U.S. image abroad, to say nothing of its involvement in the international scene, has been, to my mind, catastrophic. Yeah. And so there's a lot to be unpacked there. But let's talk about the trends.
Yeah.
It seems to me that across virtually all demographics, he's polling very, very poorly, including what should be safe states, safe red states, such as the state of Georgia, which now increasingly appears to be contested. So yes, let's have a look at the polls before we dig deeper.
Yeah, I can bring up Georgia if you like, Paul. Let's just see if we can do that. So we'll go down, pull up Georgia, just while we're kind of looking into that. So we should have that on screen now. So yeah, what it's showing there is going back to May, but the graph, if we just try and bring it across, where are we? Up here, October 13. Is that giving you a better picture there, perhaps? And you can see Biden pulling ahead, which, 47.8 points to 46.5. So this is the very close race here, of course. And this is what you're highlighting, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah. What's happened is the accumulation of his errors, culminating in his contracting COVID and the whole circus show around that, appears to have alienated elderly people in a very big way. including his dismissal. We'll leave aside the real circus of him riding around in a van, standing up on the balcony. I mean, that sort of theatrics. But the impact of him saying that the U.S. has nothing to fear or should not fear COVID, when over 215,000 people have died, what is it, 5 million have the disease, and most of the dead are people of color and the elderly.
Yeah.
And so in places like Georgia, which has a very large African American population that has traditionally been suppressed by Republican control of that state, you're now seeing them vote in droves. I mean, they're standing for 11 hours, 12 hours to do early voting. This is extraordinary. Plus, in the state where I still have ties, Florida, that's a state where a lot of people go to retire. And so outside of South Florida, which is very Hispanic, it's a mostly Republican state. And there too, a lot of the elderly have said enough is enough. We could deal with his crass behavior so long as his tax policies favored us and that sort of thing. But once he went into the COVID mismanagement, and let's be clear, health is a very important thing to elderly people.
Yeah.
They
Particularly in
turned
a
on him.
pandemic like this. And
Exactly.
you can actually see this. Let's I'll just see if I can make reference to that. So looking here, going back a week, basically when Trump is emerging out of that space where he's going back to the White House, he's ripped off his mask, he's saying, I'm over COVID, it's a winnable thing, don't let it kind of rock your boat. That type of message coming out of the White House, and also everybody realising that the White House is infected to the gunnels with this particular virus. And you see here the trend. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but so that's around about September 30th. Look at how Biden is picking up over all that time. Slight, around the 10.5, 10.3 lead that he has. This is in the national popular polls, of course. And this is Nat Silver's 538.com that we're referring to here, most importantly. But look at how far down Trump goes at the same time. There's just no room for tolerance on this particular issue as it appears in these poll of polls. Paul, I'll just pick up some of the swing states. This is The Guardian. They're putting out graphics here. And you look at Florida, which is always, that's the must win in a sense for the Republicans, isn't it? And this is the whole state, and we know that he's got big pockets of support around the Panhandle and big turnout around that. But Biden, 49.3 to Trump's 46 in Florida. If you're looking at, the Guardian's run down here and its polls on the 12th of October, in the Pennsylvania, 50.7 to 44.3 in favour of Biden. Ohio, holding out there for Trump. If you look at the 11th of October in Ohio, 18 electoral college votes there, of course, 47.6 to 45.6. And Michigan, well ahead, to Biden there. These states where it proved that Hillary Clinton was not able to win, really coming through at this stage in the game, well over the 50% mark, 50.7% in Michigan. So we could go on, Paul. It just looks like if we, the New York Times here, it's just if you look at their graph on the right-hand side, it's a sea of blue. Even when they factor in where the polls were wrong in 2016 to what the actual vote was, it's still a blue win to Biden, significantly down there. Texas, for example, staying with Trump.
No, it's a remarkable change in fortunes. I just add two other things because I think the trends are clear.
Yeah.
I will point out, though, that the other state that I have personal ties to, Arizona, a state that has been Republican for over 50 years when it comes to control of the Senate and its House representation in the majority, looks increasingly like it's going to go blue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my point with Arizona, which again used to be a locked-in red state, is that it is a very strong chance they're going to lose a Senate seat to the Democrats in Arizona. And what that means is the down ballot impact of Trump, the negative down ballot impact of Trump is now starting to be felt throughout the country. And so the danger is not that they're going to lose the presidency. I think that that is almost assured at this point. But the danger for the Republicans is that they could lose the Senate. And if they lose the Senate, then if it's true that a Biden presidency will add additional seats to the Supreme Court, it's guaranteed that he will be able to do so because he'll have that Democratic majority.
On that point, the Democrats, should they win the Senate, etc., they can stack the Supreme Court, even potentially from a moralistic point of view, of addressing a potential imbalance and bias toward Republican interests and conservative interests. I picked up a few trends in the United States where they were saying, well, that's where it would be justified outside of politics. Is that fair to place it in that kind of way?
Yeah, and it's also, but let's put it pragmatically. I resist the term stack the Supreme Court. And the reason for that is that the numbers of justices on the Supreme Court is like an accordion. It expands and contracts depending on the political winds of generations. So the court has been, as recently as the 1960s, an 11-member court. Yes. And then it was contracted under the Nixon administration in part to start skewing it in a right-wing direction. You know, he had I think he had two appointments. He was coming out of the Warren Court, which was a John Kennedy era court. And so it was contracted as recently as around 1970. I may not have the date exactly right. There's no constitutional restrictions on the size of the Supreme Court.
Okay.
It's yet again a matter of convention. And given that the Republicans have made very clear they're putting increasingly ideological zealots into the court, if Biden decides that he's got to moderate that by bringing a few liberals in, there's nothing stopping him except the Senate majority. So, you know, that much is good. I'll also point out, just to finish the argument about trends, is the only constituencies that Trump is still winning are non-university educated white males over the age of 40 and then rural voters in red states.
Yeah.
Every other demographic is increasingly going towards Biden. So if I was a Republican strategist, I would give up on Trump and I would try to save as many congressional seats as possible in order to stave off what could be 4 to 8 years of not only Democratic victories, but Democratic dominance
and control
of the political process.
Control of both significant tiers of checks and balances. So that's something that hasn't been enjoyed by a presidency for some time, isn't it? To have both the House and the Senate.
Exactly. I think the last time was Obama's first term.
First term, yeah. So let's actually let's get into some of the foreign policy, Paul, really, and looking forward to this. In particular, if Democrat candidate Joe Biden wins the presidency, what would this mean for the rest of the world? And let's just go, and I'm making reference here to a piece that you wrote in kiwipolitico.com, where you're thrashing this out. So can you talk us through this a bit here, Paul?
Well, the first thing that's going to happen is there's going to be a huge sigh of relief throughout the Democratic world that Trump is gone. Autocrats like Vladimir Putin may be unhappy that Biden wins, but most of the world will be very happy that sanity will be restored to the White House. Now, that doesn't mean that there's going to be major change forthcoming soon. And the reason I say that is it's at least a two-step process in order to reconstruct and restore the United States. It will not be able to go back to its former role as the world's policeman and that sort of thing. But
why do you, sorry, just on that point, why do you think that that's the case?
Well, I mean, the key thing is that the world has changed dramatically, in some ways aided and abetted by Trump. But in other ways, it's just the dynamics of the international system. As you and I have talked about from time to time, the international system is moving from what used to be during the Cold War what they called a tight bipolar system,
Yeah.
two superpowers confronting each other with their alliance structures surrounding them, then to a unipolar world after the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States rose as the dominant superpower. Now we're moving to a multipolar world, in part because of economic globalization, in part because of cultural diffusion, but you now have great powers emerging, like India, still a ways off, but it's clearly on the scene. Obviously, China is a great power. You have some resurrecting powers. The Russians may or may not be one of those. But the fact is, the era of U.S. so-called hegemonic dominance is over.
And
It's
over for a long period of time. So this is what I guess you're arguing, that what's required here of the United States, should Biden win, is some real heavy hitters, some real thinking brains that know presidencies, they know administrations, they've got that experience, and you're underlining there Barack Obama as being a significant appointee potentially in a Biden-led administration. So, and I put that, a Biden-led administration, on purpose there, Paul. Now, you're speaking in this piece directly to that point where the world is a different place as it was during Barack Obama's term in office, and not necessarily one that looks to the United States for unchallenged leadership or moral guidance. And I guess that's a theme of what we have thrashed out in previous episodes. So what kind of, do you see this appointment, if you can first describe what it is, and also how would Barack Obama be received by significant authoritarian leaders around the world?
All right, let me offer some backdrop to that particular suggestion. The Biden administration, the first thing it has to do is reconstruct the State Department, reestablish the diplomatic corps, which has been decimated by the Trump administration, and particularly by current Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It needs the human personnel. It's been hollowed out completely. So that's the first order of business. Now, my understanding is that Biden has currently 1,500 foreign policy experts aggregated into 300 committees examining the minutiae of U.S. foreign policy in great detail. So he's got this stable of experts already working for a post-Trump future. And that's the good news. The trouble is, most of these people are relics of the Obama and Clinton administration. There are some young, some progressive people that I believe need to come up through the ranks, unencumbered by the baggage of association with those two previous Democratic administrations. But the largest shortcoming, I think, is that Biden, Obama, and I'll get to him in a second, all the Clintonites and Obamaites subscribe to this theoretical notion known as liberal internationalism. Now, liberal internationalism has held together the U.S. foreign policy community for over 50 years. And what it basically says is that the combination of democracy and free markets is the best guarantor of both national and global stability. The idea that you have freely elected governments, free markets, is the best guarantor of a good life and prosperity for everybody. Well, that may or may not have been true during the Cold War and during the years of U.S. hegemony in the 1990s. But it's no longer true. We've now seen the downside of so-called free markets throughout the world, increasing income disparities, concentrations of wealth, hyper-concentration of commodity production in low-wage states, those sort of things. And we've seen the resurgence of authoritarianism, because in many countries, democracy has not delivered on the promises embedded in the concepts of freedom. What it has allowed is for lobbying, it's allowed for profiteering under the guise of electoral legitimacy. And I happen to think democracy is the best possible political form, but that's not necessarily the case throughout the world. And so that has to be confronted. The idea, simply that the United States needs to review its embrace of liberal internationalism, and if not abandon it, modify it for the realities of the current moment. And I'll give you an example where it failed. And this lays squarely at the feet of Barack Obama. Barack Obama and his crowd, a very talented crowd, foreign policy crowd that is, believed that bringing China into the World Trade Organization and treating them like an equal when it came to terms of trade would somehow democratize or help democratize the Chinese political system. And for all the China experts that exist in the United States, that was a pipe dream. There was no way the Chinese Communist Party, much less Chinese culture, Han culture, was going to democratize in the space of a decade because they happen to be open to trade with the global community. And so that naivete needs to be abandoned.
And you're also pointing out in your piece that the United States needs to realise it is no longer the world's policeman on the block, basically. That the erosion of its voice, the erosion of it being a reliable leader from the point of view of the globe's democracy efforts and the moralistic argument have been eroded under Trump. So that point there I find really interesting. You also talk about, perhaps we could go into it at this juncture, the idea that Hillary Clinton is showing interest in having a role should Biden win the presidency. And just on that point, I'll bring in a question that Kevin Hester has put to us here. And I'm losing a little bit. I'll just go back to our window there so I can actually see it and bring it back. Kevin asks here, he'd be interested to know what Paul thinks about Hillary Clinton's role in this election, and is she about to make a comeback? He says he finds that possibility terrifying. So, Paul, if you can speak to that point, that would be certainly an interesting angle, because this is one that's shared by a lot of people, particularly on the humanitarian left, yeah?
Yeah. I'm not as terrified as Kevin is, but let me say this, because I've been doing a little Obama bashing here, and I really don't mean to. What I'm trying to say is both the theoretical premises as well as the personnel of foreign policy need to be thought through and substantially changed, to be honest. And Biden's the person to do that. Why? Because he has the ability to convene incredibly talented people with vast experience and then mix them in with newer voices in U.S. foreign policy. And so here's the examples I offered in that particular blog post. You could make Barack Obama, should he be willing to do so, a special ambassador, a special envoy, and have him hit the really hard nuts to crack in U.S. foreign policy. He wouldn't be the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State would deal with rebuilding the State Department, would deal with the daily affairs of diplomacy. But let's say, for example, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Yeah.
Which
now, Obama was critical in the latter part of his presidency, obviously showing a certain degree of distance and separation on Israel, in particular on the Palestinian human rights elements. Yeah.
And there are many others. I mean, he needs to get on board with the I say by that I mean Biden, the START talks with Russia, that intermediate range missile delimitation agreement ends in early February.
Yeah.
This is about intermediate range nuclear weapons. Trump has abandoned it. Trump has given it up. That needs to be a first priority. Relationships with North Korea. Well, this is what I would say. Biden talks to Obama, and we know their history, okay? They're very close.
Obviously. Yeah.
Obama used to be Biden's boss.
Yeah.
And Biden says to Obama, look, I'm going to give you a lot of freedom of maneuver because you know the history, you know the issues, you know the people, and you know the principles involved. And so go out and negotiate on behalf of your country. Because I truly believe that Obama believes in public service to the nation. He could make a lot of money as a private citizen, There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But
I mean, he's
think this
also
is
very significantly well respected around the world, and some would argue that why is that so? But then others are certainly saying that he is one of the globe's most trusted leaders, albeit former. So
Yes.
that comes through very strongly in your piece in Kiwi Politico. Also, what here we get back to Kevin's point, and I guess what he was
I'm
wanting
getting
is,
to her.
yeah, and you're talking significantly about Hillary Clinton having written about the 4Ds. So when you do get to Hillary Clinton talking about that, it'd be good to actually expand out what role you think she would play, or whether or not she is just kind of putting her hand up and saying, "I'd like a piece of the action here."
Yeah. Okay. So again, a little backdrop to my answer to Kevin.
Yeah.
The second suggestion I made in that blog post was that perhaps, given what Hillary Clinton has recently written, and she's clearly positioning herself for a role of influence in the Biden administration, is that perhaps she would make a good Secretary of Defense. And the reason I say that, again, she has the experience, she knows the people, the issues, and no one can accuse her of being a pacifist. I mean, this is a rather hawkish Democrat, but she understands the
Some would say
failings
she was a warmonger, Paul, around the world in some courts. Is that unfair?
I think it's a little overdrawn to say that she's a warmonger. What they did, which turns out to be a mistake, is they confused existential conflicts with principled conflicts. They adopted something called P2P, the principle to protect. And that basically is designed to prevent genocides. They invoked it to interfere in Libya, and we saw how that turned out. They got themselves involved in conflicts that were not existential. But my idea is that Hillary Clinton, as well as Barack Obama, have the capability to learn from their mistakes. And I think they realize that not only has the world changed, but the Democratic Party has changed. Remember that both of these politicians have to look at the left wing of their base, not only to help Biden win this election, but then to help him govern. They need that left wing in government, whether they like it or not. And they're smart enough to realize that. So I thought, where could you put Hillary that would not send people, perhaps like Kevin, through the roof?
Kevin's not convinced by this, Paul. I've just got to say a couple of the responses and the message there. He's not on board with it.
Yeah, but I'll get to the 4Ds, and this is why I think it might work. I do believe that these people can learn from their experiences. She has just written a piece for Foreign Affairs in which she points out that the U.S. needs to review the so-called 4Ds of foreign policy, those Ds being defense, diplomacy, development, and the domestic economy. And she puts a lot of emphasis on the domestic economy, which is the United States needs more of an industrial base. It's too dependent on the sea lanes of communication in the event of war, something very sort of realist, geopolitical in nature. But she spends a lot of time talking about the United States needs to re-emphasize the diplomatic side and the development side of U.S. foreign policy, that U.S. foreign policy has become too military-driven in the last 20 years, including during her own administration. And I thought to myself, if she truly believes this, she talks a lot about defense reform.
Yeah.
And to give you the example that she addresses, a lot of what the U.S. has in terms of weapons are what we call legacy weapons. They're no longer suitable for the battlefields of the present and the future, but they employ large numbers of people in very important congressional districts. And so they're funded. The Lightning fighter, the P-35, the F-35, is a golden albatross of a warplane. and yet it keeps on getting funded. It can't do anything really well.
At the same time, as a Secretary of Defence, she would have her hand and authority on some impressive hardware, some impressive technologies.
Well, I'll give you, but see, this is what she's looking at. She's looking at all that wasteful spending on increasingly obsolescent weapons. And then she's looking, for example, at this conflict between Azerbaijan and Albania. This conflict, and we talked a little bit about it last week.
We did.
This is amazing. The Azerbaijanis, fueled, equipped, by Turkish weapons, are using Chinese-copied Turkish drones and long-range cruise missiles to decimate the Armenian forces. The Armenians are using obsolescent Russian tactics. They're digging in their armor and waiting for a land invasion that will never come. And they're getting pounded from the air.
Are you suggesting that under the Biden administration, that should Hillary Clinton become Secretary of Defense, that they would get involved in such conflicts?
No, what I'm saying is that they look across and they see the future of warfare objectively, without the political strings and pork barreling that goes on in the U.S. weapons procurement process. And they say, you know what? We're going to kill off the F-35.
Oh, okay.
Get
rid of the redundancies.
We've poured money down innumerable toilets when it comes to weapon systems. Look at the way warfare is going. I'll give you another instance. The Chinese are going to fight the United States in the South China Sea and Western Pacific, not with a huge navy. They are going to unleash a barrage of cruise missiles, intermediate range missiles that are designed to kill U.S. ships, carriers in particular. So the U.S. is going to put a lot of human lives on the line throughout the Western Pacific. The Chinese are going to stay at home and fire these autonomous weapons by the drove. We're talking thousands of these missiles in a barrage. And they will take out U.S. military assets in large numbers. The future of warfare is automated. The future of warfare is miniaturized. The future of warfare is not manned aircraft and aircraft carriers. It's drones, cruise missiles, submarines.
I get that, but I put the question back to you. If that is the challenge for the United States' foreign policy, if that is a significant concern, is Hillary Clinton the solution?
Well, it all depends on whether A, she's learned from her mistakes, and B, whether she's not dominated by corporate interests.
Yeah.
And I will say this: I separate Barack Obama, who I believe truly has public service foremost in his mind, from Hillary Clinton, who I'm not entirely sure that that's the first thing on her mind. But I do respect her experience, and I don't buy, all of the disinformation used against her in the 2016 campaign. I don't buy it. If you think that Hillary Clinton was the most corrupt politician in U.S. history, you need to rethink that. Hillary Clinton was a run-of-the-mill politician with an extraordinary amount of experience who got done in by the Russians and people like Steve Bannon. Now,
and Donald Trump's whole the machine that took them by surprise, yeah, and also perhaps by democratic abandonment of some of the important elements of United States society, infrastructure, etc., and on it goes. So, in some ways, I guess what I'm saying here is you don't lose the Rust Belts by chance or by Russian interference. There are reasons for that.
Yeah, but let's remember, Hillary, the Secretary of Defense is confirmed by the Senate. Again, if the Democrats win the Senate, she can be free. She's not going to run for election ever again.
Yeah, of course.
She knows she's done.
Yeah.
Now, people can keep on barking about Hillary, and I happen to think there is a lot of misogyny in this hatred of Hillary Clinton. I really think it's outrageous.
Right.
This woman has unbelievable experience on a number of levels. Her talent should not be wasted on the talk circuit. What you have to do is constrain her. You have to make sure that she is not susceptible to the entreaties of the corporate elite that dominate weapons procurement or procurement in general within the Defense Department. And if she can do those things. Let's face it, when I worked for the Clinton administration, the person that everybody feared the most was Hillary, not Bill. And it's because her intellect is formidable. I think even the generals would quake in their boots at the thought of her becoming Secretary of Defense. And let's be very honest, one of the main reasons the Russians interfered in 2016 was not because they liked Donald Trump.
To keep her out, yeah.
They were scared of her. They knew what she was. So I think we need to consider it.
Yeah, yeah. Before we wrap this up, I just brought up on screen a few moments ago a question in from David. I'll just bring this up again. And it might be a good way of kind of talking to that Trump point. Any chance during the years of the US Democratic Party dominance that the old guard of the Republican Party be replaced with both parties undergo internal reform to prevent another Trump-style presidency? I think the underscoring of that is in the last part of that question, is what can take place with internal reform of both of the parties to prevent another Trump-style presidency, Paul? Because I think everybody is realizing it's a disaster.
Yeah, and thanks to David for that. Actually, years ago, I wrote a piece, I was interviewed in a New Zealand news magazine, and I said, Trump is going to destroy the Republican Party. Now, I was wrong because that was during the primaries in 2015, 2016, and I thought he would destroy them during the primaries. He did not. He took the GOP over. But I'm still right because he will destroy the Republican Party.
It was just a matter of when. Yeah.
When. We needed him in office to do the deed. And what's going to happen in my mind is the Republican Party is going to split. One faction will be the Trumpites, and they will continue on even without Trump. They'll find some other populist who will try to emulate him. He may come back and run again, and there's nothing to prevent him from running again if he loses this election. So,
take your point.
Pardon me. But the traditional Republicans, the people who are not populists, again, people who are into free markets, who are not interested in having religion come into the bedrooms of the U.S. public, those folk, I tend to think of guys like Mitt Romney, what John McCain used to be. They're going to regroup and use what looks to be a landslide defeat in the making as a reason to purge the party of the populists. And so they will push the populists out. The populists will reconvene as a third party, and we'll take it from there. Now, this over the short term is very good for the Democrats. Over the long term, it's actually better for the country as a whole to have a third party be able to mediate between the two dominant parties, and especially if it's on the right. See, the third party options in the United States have tended to be the Greens, various Communist Party factions, and they get no traction whatsoever. A party on the hard right, an evangelical populist party, will garner a significant amount of votes, even though it splits it off from the traditional Republicans. But you give it, a decade or two, and they can settle in to a significant political presence on the political landscape, and that may encourage parties from other ideological dimensions to get involved. I happen to be a fan of MMP, what we have here in New Zealand.
Germany has it, Japan has it.
I think for very advanced liberal democracies, first past the post, two-party systems are increasingly archaic. Our societies are too diverse, both ideologically and demographically. The U.S. needs to move in that direction. And just like with foreign policy, if the Biden administration has the ability to self-reflect and see the need for reform across the board, not just in foreign policy, both theoretically, ideologically, but as well in terms of the personnel involved in making policy decisions, then the United States will come out of this election a lot better than it was in 2016.
Okay, Paul, on that point, let's wrap it up for the week, and we'll be back at this time next week to dig into, no doubt, a little bit more of the United States' influence around the world, what it possibly could be, where it's tracking, and of course, what is most likely outcomes from the United States' elections. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you for the questions that have come in during the live session. Very much encourage that. Thank you, Paul. We'll see you next week.
Cheers.